It's strange how a single sentence can stay lodged in your chest like a thorn. "Just sit in the corner, Mom." That's all she said. My own daughter on a day that was supposed to be filled with joy. I smiled, just like I've always done. But inside, I felt something shift, something heavy. My name is Margaret. I'm 72 years old, a widow of nearly 15 years, and a woman who has spent most of her life believing that family was the truest measure of wealth. I raised my daughter on my own after my husband died too young, and I poured every ounce of myself into making sure she and her boy, my grandson, never had to feel the kind of loss I did. I thought that love, sacrifice, and devotion built bonds too strong to break. But on the day of my grandson's birthday, I learned that even a mother can be made to feel like a stranger in the very home she made possible. The house was buzzing with noise when I arrived. Streamers in bright blue and yellow curled across the walls, and balloons floated along the ceiling, brushing against the light fixtures. Children ran through the living room in socks, laughing, squealing, chasing each other with cupcake-stained hands. I had wrapped my gift carefully, a quilt I'd spent 3 months stitching by hand, each patch carrying a memory of his childhood. I remember holding it close to me on the way inside, almost like a shield. My grandson, Thomas, spotted me first. His face lit up, and he ran across the room, his small arms clutching around my waist. That hug, warm, tight, innocent, was the highlight of my day. "Grandma's here!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the music and chatter. For a brief moment, the room seemed to brighten. My heart swelled because in his eyes, I was still the hero of the story. Then my daughter appeared, Emily. 45 years old, successful in her career, married to a man who liked to remind me that he provided for the family now. She came toward me, her smile polite, her arms crossed as though she wasn't sure whether to hug me or usher me aside. "Hi, Mom," she said briskly, taking the gift from my hands before I could even explain what it was. "Why don't you just sit in the corner? We've got a lot going on." It was quick, casual, almost careless. But I felt the words land heavy, as though the whole room had turned to look. My cheeks burned. I swallowed the lump that formed in my throat and forced a smile, as if it hadn't stung. "Of course," I whispered, adjusting the strap of my purse on my shoulder. I walked slowly toward a chair tucked against the wall near the window, away from the laughter, away from the photographs being snapped. From that corner, I watched. Parents gathered around the cake, phones raised, documenting every second. My daughter laughed freely with her friends, her hand resting on her husband's arm. They looked like the perfect family, except for the woman sitting quietly at the edge of the room. Me. I traced my fingers along the hem of my dress, feeling the careful stitches. I'd chosen something cheerful, pastel blue with little pearl buttons, because I didn't want to look drab or forgotten. Still, I sat there invisible, the noise of celebration swirling around me like I was a ghost, haunting the edges of a memory. Every so often, Thomas would break from the crowd and run to me. He would climb into my lap, show me his new toys, and ask, "Are you watching, Grandma?" I always nodded, always smiled, always kissed the top of his hair. But each time, Emily would call him back, her voice sharper than necessary. "Thomas, come on, your friends are waiting." It was as though she couldn't bear for him to linger too long in my shadow. When they sang "Happy Birthday," I clapped along softly, though no one turned to look at me. The cameras flashed, the candles flickered, and when the song ended, I realized they had arranged themselves neatly for photos. Parents behind the cake, children gathered around, grandparents from her husband's side pulled into the frame. But not me. I waited, half expecting Emily to wave me over to say, "Come on, Mom, you should be in this one." Instead, she glanced toward me briefly, then looked away. The photographer counted down, the family smiled, and the shutter clicked. That was when I stood. Quietly, I reached for my coat. My grandson tugged at my hand, asking if I was leaving already. I kissed his forehead and whispered that Grandma was just tired. No one else noticed when I slipped out the door. The air outside was sharp and cool, a relief against the warmth of my burning cheeks. I walked to my car slowly, each step heavier than the last. By the time I slid behind the wheel, my hands were trembling. "Just sit in the corner, Mom." The words echoed in my ears, louder than the laughter I'd left behind. I gripped the steering wheel and forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was just a moment, just a thoughtless slip. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was a glimpse into how she truly saw me. I didn't drive straight home that evening. Instead, I pulled into the old church parking lot a few blocks away and just sat there, staring at the dark outline of the steeple against the sky. That church had seen me through so many seasons of my life, my wedding, my husband's funeral, and even Emily's christening when she was just a baby. It felt strange, sitting there alone, realizing that the child I had once carried in my arms had just told me to sit in the corner. I thought back to all the corners I had already endured in my life. The small apartment where Emily and I lived after her father passed. The long nights I worked sewing and bookkeeping just to keep us fed. The corners of factory floors where I'd sit during my lunch breaks, counting pennies in my hand, praying I could stretch them until the weekend. Emily doesn't remember those days, but I do. When she was 12, we were evicted from that cramped apartment because I couldn't keep up with the rent after losing a second job. I remember sitting with her on the curb, our belongings packed into 3 old suitcases. She cried into my shoulder and asked, "Where will we go, Mom?" And I told her, "Somewhere better, sweetheart. Somewhere that's ours." I meant it, and I kept my promise. Over the years, I worked 2 and 3 jobs. I mended clothes, babysat other people's children, cleaned offices late at night. I saved every extra dollar, every bit of overtime. I denied myself new clothes, vacations, even a car for years. Everything went into the dream of a house. By the time Emily finished college, I had enough saved for a down payment. It was the proudest moment of my life when I signed those papers, my name written carefully on the deed of a little 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. That house wasn't just brick and wood. It was a shield against every corner we'd ever been shoved into. When Emily married, she and her husband moved in. They insisted they would pay rent, but truthfully, they never did. I waved it off. "This house is for you," I said, "for your family." I told myself that one day Emily would understand the sacrifice behind those walls, that she'd see every nail and every patch of paint as part of the love I poured into her life. I remember the first night Thomas came home from the hospital. Emily was exhausted, her husband pacing nervously, unsure how to hold the tiny newborn. I sat on that same living room couch, the one I'd saved up for at the thrift store, and cradled him in my arms. His little fingers curled around mine, and I whispered a promise. "I'll always be here for you. Always." And I was. Through colic, fevers, scraped knees, and birthday parties, that house wasn't just a roof. It was the anchor that kept us together. Which is why sitting in that corner at his birthday, being told to stay out of the way, cut deeper than Emily could ever realize. Because that wasn't just any corner. That was my house. Every balloon taped to the wall, every streamer hanging from the banister, every photo snapped in front of the fireplace. Those were mine. Paid for with the sweat of my youth and the ache of my bones. Yet as I sat there, they acted as though I were the guest, as though I had no claim to the very ground beneath their feet. The worst part? They didn't even remember. Back at home later that night, I opened the old wooden chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were neatly stacked papers, tax receipts, mortgage statements, and the original deed with my name printed clearly. Margaret Ann Hayes, sole owner. I ran my hand over the paper, tracing the ink with my finger. It was almost laughable, the way Emily and her husband spoke about our home, the way she posted pictures online with captions like, So grateful for everything we've built together. Everything we've built. I pressed the deed flat on the bedspread and stared at it for a long time. No, I hadn't built it with her husband. He wasn't there when I worked double shifts at the diner. He wasn't there when I walked home at midnight, clutching my purse, praying no one would stop me. He wasn't there when I sat at the kitchen table counting coins, deciding between paying the gas bill or buying Emily a new pair of shoes. This house wasn't theirs. It was mine. And yet, I let them believe it. Maybe that was my mistake. I wanted Emily to feel secure, to have the kind of life I never did. I thought giving freely would make her grateful, would make her kind. But perhaps I gave too much. Perhaps in giving her everything, I taught her to value nothing. As I sat on the edge of my bed, deed in hand, I realized something I had never dared to admit before. Emily didn't see me as the foundation of her life anymore. She saw me as clutter, as someone who belonged in the corner, out of sight. That realization broke something inside me, but it also lit a spark. Because I may be 72, but I am not invisible. And if she wanted to forget whose house she was living in, maybe it was time I reminded her. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun was barely peeking through the curtains, painting the room with a pale gold glow. My joints ached, the way they always do, but it wasn't my body that felt heavy. It was my heart. The memory of yesterday clung to me like a damp coat. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table. The steam curled in front of me as I opened my laptop. It had become a small ritual of mine, checking in on the world through my daughter's posts. I knew it was the only way I'd see glimpses of my grandson's growing life. The soccer games, the school plays, the milestones that Emily rarely told me about directly anymore. I told myself I was ready. I told myself I'd smile at the pictures, that seeing Thomas's happiness would be enough, but I wasn't ready. Her page was filled with album after album of the party. The decorations looked even more vibrant in the photographs, the cake grander, the laughter brighter. There were dozens of shots, children with frosting on their cheeks, Emily with her husband's arm wrapped proudly around her waist, grandparents from his side holding Thomas in their arms. I scrolled slowly, my eyes scanning each frame, searching for myself. Nothing. I went through them twice, then 3 times, my chest tightening with each click. Not one photo showed me, not even in the background. It was as if I had never been there. The irony was sharp. There, in the background of one smiling family photo, I could see the quilt I had made, folded neatly on the gift table. My gift was there. My presence wasn't. The comments began, flooding in. "Beautiful home, Emily. What a perfect party. You and your family look amazing together." Each word was like a pinprick. Beautiful home. Perfect party. Amazing family. And not once did anyone notice that the woman who had made that home possible wasn't even in the frame. It wasn't just being left out, it was being erased, because photos last longer than parties. They become the story people tell themselves later, the evidence of who was really there. One day, Thomas would scroll back through those pictures. He would see the balloons, the cake, the laughter, and he wouldn't see me. He'd believe I wasn't there, even though I'd sat in that corner the whole time. I closed the laptop, but the images kept replaying in my mind. My daughter's smile, her husband's confident arm around her shoulders, the way the walls of my house framed their perfect little life. They were building their legacy on my foundation, and they didn't even have the courtesy to let me exist in it. I walked slowly through my own home, my slippers brushing against the carpet. The walls felt closer than usual, the air heavier. On the mantel sat framed photographs of years gone by. Emily at her high school graduation, me standing proudly at her side, Emily at her wedding, my hand resting on hers as though I were passing her into her new life. In every one of those pictures, I had been present. I had been part of the story. Now I was an afterthought, or worse, deliberately excluded. Around midday, I called Emily. My hands shook as I held the phone to my ear. When she answered, her voice was chipper, still riding the high of the party. "Hi, Mom. Did you get home okay?" "Yes," I said softly. "I did." I hesitated, then asked, "I was looking through the photos this morning. I didn't see myself in any of them." There was a pause, followed by a light laugh. "Oh, Mom, don't be silly. We had so many pictures. It's not like we could include everyone. Don't take it personally." Her words cut sharper than she realized. Not like we could include everyone, but they had included everyone else. Just not me. I swallowed. "I just thought maybe, honestly, Mom," she interrupted, her tone turning brisk. "It was Thomas's day. Let's not make it about you." The line went quiet after that. I think she realized she'd said too much, but I didn't argue. I simply nodded, though she couldn't see me, and whispered, "Of course. You're right." We ended the call shortly after. I sat in the silence of my kitchen, staring at the phone on the table. My tea had gone cold. That night, as I lay in bed, the words churned in my head. Don't take it personally. It's not about you. But it was about me. It was about the way she had pushed me into the corner, erased me from the photos, and claimed a home that wasn't hers. For the first time in my life, I wondered if my daughter truly saw me as family anymore, or if I was just an inconvenience. And as I stared at the ceiling, I knew one thing for certain. Something had to change. Because I may have been written out of her photographs, but I wasn't going to let her write me out of my own story. I couldn't sleep that night. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your chest, making it hard to breathe. I got up, made myself another cup of tea, and sat by the kitchen window. Outside, the streetlights glowed faintly, casting shadows across the empty road. That's the thing about getting older. Nights seem longer, heavier. When you're young, silence is peace. When you're old, silence is memory. Every tick of the clock reminded me of something I'd given, something I'd lost, something I'd endured. I thought about Emily's words. It's not about you. Wasn't that the story of aging? Slowly becoming invisible. People forget you have a past, forget the sacrifices you made, forget the nights you went without so they could have. You become a piece of furniture, something useful when needed, easily ignored otherwise. I thought back to when I was young, when my own mother lived with us. She had arthritis so bad she could barely move her hands, but I remember brushing her hair every morning, sitting with her in the evenings just to hear her stories. She wasn't a burden to me. She was my mother. I loved her presence, even when it meant adjusting my life. And now, here I was, on the other end of the story, told to sit in the corner. I ran my hand over the table's surface, feeling the small grooves where Thomas had once scratched it with his toy cars. Those marks made me smile then, though I scolded him at the time. That's what a home was to me, living proof of love, memory, family. But Emily didn't see it that way. To her, the house was just another symbol of status, something to display in photos and caption with words like, "our journey and our hard work." Except it wasn't hers. That thought burned in me stronger than it had the night before. You see, when you spend your whole life giving, people forget you can also take away. They confuse kindness for weakness, patience for passivity. They think your silence means you have no voice. But I had a voice. And though my daughter may not want to hear it, she was about to. I pulled the deed out again, laying it on the table under the kitchen light. The paper was old but still crisp, the ink steady. Margaret Ann Hayes, sole owner. Those words gave me strength. For years, I had told myself this was Emily's house, too. I convinced myself it was fine to let her take the credit, to let her feel proud. But as I looked at that piece of paper, I realized something. I hadn't just given her a home. I had given her my power, and she had used that power to push me into the corner. No more. I wasn't thinking of revenge. Not yet. I wasn't planning to take anything from her at that moment. But I began to understand that if I didn't do something, I'd be erased completely. Not just from photographs, but from memory. I remembered my husband's last words to me, whispered in that hospital bed all those years ago. Take care of her. Don't let her forget where she came from. I had taken care of her, all right. I had carried her farther than she'd ever know. But now she was forgetting. She was rewriting the story as though I had never been there, and I couldn't let that stand. I thought of Thomas, sweet, bright-eyed Thomas, who still saw me as Grandma, who still ran into my arms, who asked if I was watching. He didn't deserve to grow up believing I had been nothing more than a shadow in the background. If I stayed silent, if I accepted the corner, then one day he'd flip through those photographs and believe that his grandmother hadn't been there, that she hadn't cared, that she hadn't loved him enough to be part of his life. That wasn't going to be my legacy. I pressed my hand against the cool surface of the deed and made myself a promise. I would no longer be silent. I didn't know yet what form that would take, whether it would be words, actions, or something more drastic, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My daughter had mistaken my quiet dignity for weakness, and the next time she tried to push me into the corner, she would find out I was far stronger than she imagined. The kettle clicked off again behind me, the steam curling into the air. I poured another cup, steadier this time, and sat at the table until the sky turned from black to gray. By morning, I felt different. Not lighter, no, the weight was still there, but sharper, focused. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was planning. 2 days passed before I worked up the courage to call Emily again. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say over and over in my head while folding laundry, while watering the plants, even while brushing my teeth. I told myself to stay calm, to avoid sounding bitter, to make her understand without turning it into an argument. After all, she was my daughter. Surely if I spoke from the heart, she would hear me. I dialed her number and pressed the phone to my ear. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice was steady when she answered. "Hi, Mom," she said, distracted, like she was already in the middle of something. I could hear dishes clattering in the background, the faint hum of a television. "Hi, Emily," I began. "I was hoping we could talk for a few minutes, just about the party." There was a pause. "What about it?" I took a breath. I felt a little hurt. When you asked me to sit in the corner, and when I saw the photos online, I noticed wasn't in any of them. It made me feel like maybe I didn't belong. For a moment, there was silence. I thought she was considering my words, that maybe she would soften, apologize, say she hadn't realized how it felt. But when she spoke, her tone was clipped. "Mom, it was just a birthday party. You're overthinking this." "I don't think I am," I replied gently. "It's not about the party. It's about feeling invisible. I've always tried to be there for you and for Thomas, and I don't want to feel pushed aside." She sighed loudly, the kind of sigh that tells you someone wishes the conversation were over. "Look, Mom, you're making this bigger than it is. The party was for Thomas. It wasn't about you. You were there, you saw him smile, you gave your gift. Isn't that enough?" Her words stung. They weren't cruel on the surface, but the message underneath was clear. Stay in your lane. "Emily," I tried again, my voice quieter now. "This isn't just about the party. This is about the way I feel when I come over, like I'm in the way, like you'd rather I weren't there at all." This time she didn't hesitate. "Well, sometimes you are, Mom." The words hit like a slap. My throat tightened, but she kept talking. You don't realize it, but you hover. You insert yourself where you don't need to. This is our life now, mine, David's, and Thomas's. You can't expect to be at the center of everything anymore. You're a guest here, and guests shouldn't complain about where they're asked to sit. I sat there in my kitchen, phone pressed against my ear, stunned into silence. A guest. That was what I had become in the house I bought, in the family I built. I wanted to remind her of the nights I held her when she was sick, of the times I went without food so she could eat. I wanted to scream that I wasn't a guest, I was her mother, but I didn't. Instead, I closed my eyes and whispered, I see. Don't take it so hard, Mom, Emily added, softening just slightly, though the damage was done. We love you, of course, but things are different now. You'll understand someday. We said our goodbyes, and when the call ended, I sat there staring at the quiet phone. You'll understand someday. I'm 72 years old. What more was there left to understand? I had lived long enough to know what she really meant. Accept your place in the corner and be grateful you're invited at all. But gratitude isn't what I felt. What I felt was something colder, sharper. Resolve. That evening, I went for a walk around the neighborhood. The air was crisp, leaves crunching under my shoes, the world quiet except for the occasional bark of a dog. I passed by houses lit warmly from within, families gathered around dinner tables, shadows moving across curtains. I thought about how easy it is to be erased, how quickly people can push aside the very ones who built their foundation. But I also thought about how much power still lay in my hands. Emily thought I was just a guest. She thought she controlled the story now, but she had forgotten one important truth. The deed in my drawer still had my name on it. As I walked home, the porch light guiding me back, I whispered to myself, I may be old, but I am not powerless, and I am not a guest. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel weak. I felt steady, because I knew the time was coming when Emily would have to remember exactly who I was. And when that day arrived, it wouldn't be me sitting in the corner. That night, after my walk, I pulled out an old photo album. The leather cover was cracked, the corners worn from years of use. I hadn't opened it in a long time. Too many memories, too many ghosts. But something inside me needed reminding. Not of the hurt I carried now, but of the journey that had brought me here. I flipped through the pages slowly. There was Emily, age 6, missing her 2 front teeth, holding a rag doll I had sewn from scraps. There she was at 14, wearing the secondhand dress I altered so she could go to the school dance. Her smile had been radiant, unburdened. And then, a photo that always made me pause. Me, standing in front of the little 3-bedroom house with the sold sign planted in the yard. My hair was darker then, my back straighter, my eyes alight with pride. Beside me stood Emily, just 22, holding my hand and crying. "Mom," she had said that day, tears rolling down her cheeks. "You did this? For me?" "Yes," I told her, pulling her close. "For us." I can still remember that day as clearly as if it were yesterday. Signing those papers, my hands trembling, my heart pounding with the weight of all those years of sacrifice. Every late-night cleaning shift, every blister from scrubbing, every lonely meal where I stretched rice and beans just to make ends meet, it all led to that moment. When the realtor handed me the keys, I felt like I was unlocking a future, not just a front door. Emily hugged me so tightly, I thought my ribs might crack. "I'll never forget this, Mom," she whispered. "Never." And I believed her. The early years in that house were golden. Emily would call me into the kitchen to taste her first attempts at cooking, laughing when the pancakes turned out flat or the stew too salty. She would sit on the porch with me in the evenings, telling me about her day, her dreams, the family she hoped to build. When she married David, we celebrated in that very backyard. I remember stringing up fairy lights, borrowing chairs from neighbors, and staying up past midnight, dancing under the stars. She held my hands that night and said, "None of this would be possible without you, Mom." Back then, gratitude poured out of her, like water. She knew, she understood, or so I thought. When Thomas was born, the house became even more alive. I was there the day they brought him home, tiny and pink and wrapped in a hospital blanket. Emily was exhausted, overwhelmed, unsure if she could handle it all. "Mom, can you stay a few nights?" she asked, her eyes pleading. Of course I did. I cooked, I cleaned, I rocked Thomas to sleep so she could rest. I remember pacing the hallway at 2 a.m, humming the same lullabies I had once sung to her. He would curl into my chest, his little breaths warming my skin, and I would whisper, "You are safe, my darling. Grandma will always be here." Back then, Emily looked at me like I was her anchor, like I was irreplaceable. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. Maybe it was when David's career took off and they started measuring their worth by promotions and possessions. Maybe it was when Emily began comparing her life to the glossy images of her friends online. Or maybe it was simply the slow, creeping distance that sometimes wedges itself between generations. Whatever it was, the gratitude faded. The words, "Thank you, Mom," became rarer, replaced by sighs, rolled eyes, and the subtle suggestion that I was out of place. And now, years later, my presence was no longer something to be cherished. It was something to be managed. As I traced my fingers over the photograph of us in front of the sold sign, my throat tightened. She had promised she would never forget, and yet she had. The woman who once cried with gratitude now treated me like clutter in the corner. I closed the album gently, resting my hand on top of it. A wave of sorrow swept through me, but beneath it was something stronger. Determination. Because if Emily couldn't remember on her own, then perhaps it was time I reminded her. I walked to the drawer where the deed still lay, tucked safely beneath a stack of envelopes. I held it up to the light, the paper glowing faintly against the lamp. It was proof of my sacrifice, my love, my claim, proof that I was not a guest. And maybe, just maybe, it was also the key to making Emily face the truth. That night, I slept with the deed resting on my nightstand, not because I feared it would disappear, but because I needed the reminder. I needed to see it first thing when I woke, to anchor myself in the reality that despite how my daughter treated me, I still had power. And for the first time in years, I didn't just feel like a mother clinging to memories. I felt like a woman preparing for something. The next week, I found myself sitting in a lawyer's office for the first time in decades. The last time I'd needed one was when my husband passed to settle his modest estate and transfer what little we had left into my name. Back then, I had felt so small, so unprepared for the legal language, the endless paperwork. But this time, I wasn't scared. This time, I was ready. The lawyer, a calm young woman with sharp eyes and steady hands, spread the papers across her desk. She spoke clearly, patiently, as though she understood I needed the words to land not just in my ears, but in my heart. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, "this property is still in your name, sole owner. You never transferred it, never refinanced, never added your daughter or son-in-law. It is legally yours." Her words settled over me like a warm blanket. I knew it, of course. I had the deed, the receipts. But hearing it spoken aloud, official and certain, gave me strength I hadn't realized I was lacking. "So?" I asked carefully. "If I wanted to, change something? Sell, transfer, leave it to someone else?" "I could?" She nodded. "Absolutely. You have full authority. They have no legal claim without your consent." I let the silence stretch after that, sipping the cup of water she had offered me. Full authority. No claim. My daughter might act like she was queen of that house, but the crown still sat on my head. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I let the quiet fill the car as I thought through my options. I could sell the house, cash out everything I had put into it, and move somewhere peaceful. A smaller place, maybe near the coast where the mornings smelled of salt water instead of disappointment. Or I could transfer it, put it into a trust, lock it down so that Emily couldn't touch it until she learned how to value more than just appearances. Or I could simply hold on, bide my time, and wait for the moment when she least expected me to remind her whose foundation she was standing on. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and pen, writing out pros and cons the way I used to when money was tight and every decision mattered. Sell, freedom, peace, no more being treated like a guest in my own gift. Stay, keep Thomas close, keep my memories rooted in the home I built. Transfer, control, dignity, proof that I still decided how the story ended. I chewed on the end of the pen, staring at the lists until the words blurred. The truth was, it wasn't just about the house, it was about me, about how much longer I was willing to let my own daughter treat me as invisible. Now, the next morning, Emily called. Not to apologize, of course, to ask if I could watch Thomas for a few hours that weekend. Her voice was brisk, rushed, like she was giving me a task rather than offering me time with my grandson. I said yes, because I never turned down a chance to be with him. But when I hung up, I couldn't shake the thought. She wanted my labor, my reliability, my corner. But she didn't want me. And that was when the decision began to crystallize. I wouldn't confront her directly yet, not with anger, not with shouting. I would prepare quietly like a storm building over the horizon. Let her think I was still in the corner, still small, still willing to fade into the background. She wouldn't see it coming. That weekend, as Thomas played with his toy cars on my living room rug, I studied him closely. His laughter filled the house, his innocence washing away the bitterness that had lodged in my chest. When he looked up and asked, "Grandma, why don't you live with us?" My heart squeezed. I didn't answer him directly. I only smiled and said, "Because Grandma has her own little place, but I'll always be near you." Inside, though, I thought, because your mother made sure I would never belong there. When I tucked him into bed that evening, his little quilt, the one I made, pulled up to his chin. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Grandma is going to make sure you always know where you come from." He blinked up at me sleepily, not understanding. But one day, he would. Later that night, I sat once again with the deed in my hands. I thought of Emily's words, "You're a guest here." No, I wasn't. And soon she would see exactly how wrong she was. The following Sunday, I was invited, or rather expected, at Emily's house for dinner. She hadn't asked if I wanted to come. She simply called and said, "We're having a few people over tonight. Come around 6. Don't be late." I told myself it was progress, that maybe she was reaching out, maybe trying to include me after our last conversation. But the truth became clear the moment I walked through the door. The living room was full of people, friends from her work, neighbors, David's colleagues. The air smelled of roasted chicken and garlic bread, warm and welcoming. But the way Emily looked at me made me feel like I had tracked mud into her perfect home. "Mom, could you sit in the den for now?" she said quickly, not even lowering her voice. "We're using the dining table for the main guests." Main guests. The words echoed. I stood frozen for a second, clutching the pie I had baked, before nodding politely and stepping aside. I heard a couple of her friends murmur something, maybe pity, maybe judgment, but no one stopped her. I carried the pie into the den and set it on the coffee table. Alone, surrounded by shelves of books and decorations that weren't mine, I lowered myself into an armchair. From the next room, laughter rang out. Glasses clinked, plates scraped. I sat in silence, once again tucked into a corner. After a while, Thomas wandered in. His cheeks were flushed from running around, and he climbed up beside me, curling against my arm. "Grandma," he whispered, "why don't you sit with us?" My throat tightened. I smoothed his hair back gently and forced a smile. "Because Mommy asked me to sit here." He frowned, confusion clouding his little face. "But it's your house. Mommy always says it's ours, but you told me you bought it. Why don't they listen?" Out of the mouths of babes. His words hit harder than Emily's ever could, because he knew. Deep down, he knew something wasn't right. I kissed his forehead and held him close. "One day, Thomas, you'll understand. But for now, just know that Grandma loves you very much." Emily appeared in the doorway then, her arms crossed. "Thomas, come back to the table. You're being rude to the guests." He looked up at her, ready to argue, but I squeezed his hand gently and nodded. "Go on, sweetheart. I'll be fine." Reluctantly, he slid off the chair and walked back into the dining room. Emily lingered a moment, her eyes narrowing. "Mom, please don't confuse him," she said sharply. "He doesn't need to think about who owns what. This is our home, our life. Don't drag him into your feelings." My feelings, as if dignity was just an emotion, as if being erased was a mood I could shrug off. I looked up at her, steady and calm. "I didn't confuse him, Emily. He sees more than you realize." She rolled her eyes and left, her heels clicking across the hardwood. That night, after everyone had gone, I walked home under the stars instead of asking for a ride. The cool air cleared my mind. Every step away from that house, the house I bought, felt like shedding a weight. By the time I reached my front door, I knew enough was enough. I didn't cry that night. I didn't even make tea. I sat at my kitchen table with the deed laid flat in front of me, the old photo album beside it. One showed the legal truth, the other, the emotional one. Together, they told a story Emily had forgotten, and I realized it was time to remind her. Not with begging, not with quiet hints, with action. The next morning, I called the lawyer again. My voice was steady as I asked her to prepare the necessary paperwork. "I want to make changes," I told her. "Do you want to sell?" she asked. "Not yet," I replied. "But I want everything ready. I want it in writing who truly owns that house, and I want the power to decide exactly what happens to it when I say so. No one else." "Understood," she said. When I hung up, I felt a strange calm, a stillness, like the moment before a storm breaks. That evening, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. My gray hair framed my face. My wrinkles told the story of a life lived in sacrifice and endurance. But my eyes, they weren't tired anymore. They were sharp, alive, determined. I whispered to myself, "You've been in the corner long enough. Now it's time to stand." And for the first time in a long time, I slept soundly. The morning after my second meeting with the lawyer, I woke with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. It was as though a fog had lifted. For too long, I had allowed myself to drift along, letting Emily dictate where I fit in her world. But now I realized something important. I had the power to dictate where she fit in mine. I gathered the documents into a neat folder: deed, mortgage receipts, tax statements, proof not just of ownership, but of sacrifice. These papers carried my life story in black and white, harder evidence than any photograph. When I placed them in my purse, I felt their weight not as a burden, but as armor. The lawyer greeted me warmly when I arrived. "Mrs. Hayes, I've drafted a few options for you. We can set up a trust, transfer ownership to another beneficiary, or simply prepare the sale documents if you decide to move forward." I listened carefully, asking questions I never thought I'd be brave enough to ask. Each answer reinforced what I already knew. Emily had mistaken my silence for surrender, but I wasn't surrendering. I was preparing. "I want to put the house into a trust," I finally said. "Not for Emily, for Thomas." The lawyer nodded, making notes. That's entirely possible. We can stipulate conditions, when he reaches a certain age, for example. Yes, I said firmly. I want him to have it when he's grown. He deserves to know that his grandmother built something for him, not to be erased from the story. She looked up at me with something like admiration. That's a wise decision. Wise. I had been called many things in my life. Selfless, kind, even stubborn. But wise felt like a crown I hadn't worn in years. Driving home, I passed by Emily's street. I slowed the car as I went by, watching the house from a distance. The lights were on, silhouettes moving behind the curtains. I imagined them laughing, eating dinner, living in the comfort of a home they didn't own. And I smiled, not with bitterness, but with certainty, because soon they would understand. I didn't tell Emily what I had done. Not yet. There was power in silence, in letting her believe everything was as she wanted it. She still called occasionally, usually with requests. Could I watch Thomas? Could I pick him up from practice? Could I help with a bill? Just until payday. I agreed, calmly, without complaint. Let her think I was still in the corner. Let her mistake my quiet for weakness. All the while, the papers in my drawer told a different story. One evening, while Thomas sat at my table coloring, he asked me, "Grandma, is this really your house? Mommy says it's ours, but you always say you bought it." I smiled gently, leaning over to brush a stray crayon off the page. "Yes, sweetheart. I bought it a long time ago. One day you'll understand just how much that means." He tilted his head, frowning. "So it's yours?" "Yes," I said softly. "It always has been." The innocence in his question struck me again, how children see truth more clearly than adults, and I vowed silently. One day, when the time was right, he would know without doubt that his grandmother had built the foundation of his life. The turning point came when Emily announced she was planning a holiday party. She mentioned it casually over the phone, as if to rub salt into the wound. "It's going to be big this year," she said. "David invited some of his colleagues. We want to show off the house a little. Make it look perfect. Could you maybe help with the setup? We'll need someone to handle the food while we greet the guests." Handle the food. Not as a guest, not as family, as help. I clenched the phone in my hand, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Of course, Emily, I'll be there." But when I hung up, I laughed to myself, not bitterly, calmly, because if she wanted to put me in the kitchen during her grand party, then so be it. She had no idea that this time I would be walking into that house carrying more than a pie. I would be carrying the truth. That night, I laid the folder of papers on my kitchen table, flipping through them one last time. The trust documents were nearly finalized. The lawyer had assured me everything would be ready by the holidays. Emily's party would be the stage. And when the time came, I would no longer be invisible. I would no longer be in the corner. I would be the woman who built the foundation they stood on, and I would make sure they never forgot it again. The night of the holiday party, the house glowed like something out of a magazine. Lights twinkled from every window, garlands curled around the banisters. The smell of roasted turkey drifted into the cold December air. Cars lined the street, guests stepping out in their best coats, laughter spilling into the night. I arrived early carrying a casserole dish in one hand and my purse in the other. Inside, the purse was the folder. Deed, receipts, trust paperwork, my armor, my truth. Emily greeted me at the door, her smile tight, her voice brisk. "Oh, good, you're here. Can you put that in the kitchen? We'll need help keeping things warm while the guests arrive." I nodded without a word. I walked to the kitchen, set the dish down, and slipped my purse beneath the table, the folder safe inside. For the next hour, I played the part she expected of me. I refilled trays, carried drinks, kept my voice soft and polite. I watched her glow under the praise of her friends, watched David boast about the size of the living room, the new appliances, the perfect family home. Each time someone said, "You're so lucky, Emily, this house is stunning," I felt the papers burn in my purse. When the dinner began, Emily made a toast. She stood tall at the head of the table, her dress shimmering in the candlelight. "We're so grateful to have all of you here tonight. This home has been such a blessing, and we couldn't have done it without hard work, perseverance, and of course, David's endless dedication." Applause filled the room. Glasses clinked. I sat at the far end of the table, invisible once more, my hands folded in my lap. But then, something inside me shifted, because this wasn't just another party. This was my stage. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood. The room grew quiet. A few guests glanced at me politely, expecting perhaps a grandmotherly blessing or a few kind words. I lifted my glass, my voice steady. "I'd like to say something, if I may." Emily's smile faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Of course, Mom. Make it quick. We don't want to keep everyone from the meal." I ignored her jab. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of strangers and acquaintances, people who had no idea of the truth behind the walls around them. "This house," I began, "is indeed a blessing, but it wasn't built on perseverance alone. It was built on sacrifice, on years of work, on nights without sleep, on choices no one else would ever know I had to make." The room stilled. Forks hovered above plates. I reached down, pulled the folder from my purse, and placed it gently on the table. My fingers rested on the worn edge of the deed as I looked straight at Emily. "This house is mine." Gasps rippled through the room. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Emily's face drained of color. I opened the folder, sliding the papers forward so the nearest guests could see. "My name is on the deed. I bought this home. I worked for it. I paid for it. I sacrificed for it. And for years, I let my daughter live here freely, hoping she would remember the love and the labor behind these walls." My voice didn't waver. If anything, it grew stronger. But instead, I've been asked to sit in corners. I've been erased from photographs. I've been treated not as family, but as a guest. Tonight, while you celebrate the image of this perfect home, I want you to know the truth. This home does not belong to Emily. It never has. A stunned silence followed. Guests shifted awkwardly, some staring at their plates, others sneaking glances at Emily, waiting for her to respond. Emily stood abruptly, her hands trembling. "Mom, what are you doing? This isn't the time." "This is exactly the time," I said calmly, "because for too long I've been silent, and silence has made me invisible. Not anymore." I tapped the papers lightly. "These documents are more than ink and signatures. They are proof that I matter. Proof that I am not a shadow in the corner." For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the crackle of the fireplace. Then Thomas's small voice broke the stillness. "Grandma bought the house?" Every head turned. His wide eyes were fixed on me, confusion and awe mingling in his expression. "Yes, sweetheart," I said softly, my voice catching for the first time. "Grandma bought the house." And in that instant, everything was worth it. Because even if Emily refused to remember, even if her pride wouldn't let her admit it, my grandson would know. He would grow up knowing the truth. Emily's face twisted, anger flashing in her eyes. But before she could speak, I raised my glass one last time. "To truth," I said simply, "and to never being forgotten." I took a slow sip, set my glass down, and sat back in my chair. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. It was the silence of revelation, of masks slipping, of power shifting hands. And for the first time in years, I wasn't in the corner. I was at the center. The moment the toast ended, the room unraveled. Guests excused themselves quickly, some muttering polite goodbyes, others avoiding eye contact altogether. The clink of plates and silverware had vanished. The warmth of the party evaporated into cold tension. Emily stood rigid by the fireplace, her hands balled into fists. David hovered near the table, his face pale, as though he had just realized the floor beneath him wasn't as steady as he thought. Thomas, bless him, sat quietly in his chair, watching all of it with wide, uncertain eyes. When the last guest finally slipped out, leaving half-full glasses and untouched dessert behind, Emily rounded on me. "How dare you embarrass me like that in front of everyone?" Her voice cracked, high-pitched, dripping with fury. I stayed seated, folding the papers back into the folder with slow, deliberate care. "I didn't embarrass you, Emily. I told the truth. There's a difference." "You humiliated me," she snapped. "Do you have any idea what people will think now? That we're freeloaders? That we can't even afford our own house? You made us look pathetic." I looked up at her, calm. "Emily, you don't need me to make you look anything. Your actions have already spoken louder than I ever could." Her face flushed crimson. She pointed an accusing finger at me. "You had no right to make a scene like that." "No right?" I echoed softly, finally standing. I straightened my shoulders, meeting her glare head on. "This house is mine. That gives me every right. What I don't have a right to is being erased from my own story." David cleared his throat nervously. "Let's all calm down." "Don't you start," Emily snapped at him, spinning around. "You just sat there and let her—" "Let her what?" I cut in. My voice wasn't raised, but it sliced through her rant like a knife. "Let me claim what's mine. Let me remind you of the sacrifices I made so you could have this life. Don't act as if I've stolen something from you. I gave you everything, and all you gave me was a chair in the corner." Emily's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For a long moment, the three of us stood in silence. Thomas's small voice broke it. "Mommy, Grandma bought the house. Why didn't you tell me?" The look on Emily's face shifted then. Not to guilt, not to regret, but to panic. She knelt quickly, brushing his hair back, forcing a smile. "Thomas, honey, that's not important. What matters is, this is our home, and we're happy here." He frowned. "But Grandma said—" "Enough!" Emily snapped too sharply. The boy recoiled, his lip trembling. I stepped forward, my voice gentle. "Thomas, sweetheart, you can believe your grandma. Everything I said was true. One day, you'll understand why it mattered." Emily straightened, her eyes blazing. "You're trying to turn him against me, against his own mother." I shook my head. "No, Emily, I'm reminding him of the truth you tried to erase. There's a difference." Her hands shook as she pointed toward the door. "Get out." I gathered my purse and folder without argument. As I moved past her, I paused just long enough to look her in the eye. "I gave you a home. You gave me a corner. Now you'll have to learn what it feels like to live without either." Her breath caught, but I didn't wait for her reply. The night air was icy, but I felt no chill as I walked to my car. My steps were steady, my heart unshaken. Behind me, I could hear raised voices, Emily's shrill and frantic, David's low and tense, the sound of a house cracking at its foundation. When I slid into the driver's seat, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was lined with age, my hair silver, but my eyes, they burned with clarity. For years, I had believed that being a mother meant giving endlessly, forgiving endlessly, waiting endlessly. But tonight, I learned something new. Being a mother also meant knowing when to stop. At home, I placed the folder back in its drawer, smoothing the edges as though tucking in a child. I sat down with a cup of tea, steam curling into the quiet air, and let the silence fill me. Not with loneliness this time, but with peace. Emily thought I had humiliated her, but what I had done was far simpler. I had reclaimed myself, and soon She would learn the difference. The following week, I returned to the lawyer's office. My hands didn't tremble this time. I walked in with steady steps, set the folder on the desk, and said the words that had been circling in my mind since the night of the party. Let's finish it. The lawyer smiled, nodding. The trust will ensure the house passes directly to your grandson when he comes of age. No interference, no disputes. Emily will have no claim unless you specifically allow it. I sat back in the chair, a strange calm washing over me. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't even punishment. It was protection, a safeguard that my life's work would go where it was meant to go, not into the hands of entitlement, but into the heart of innocence. When the paperwork was complete, I signed my name in firm strokes, Margaret Ann Hayes. My signature wasn't as elegant as it once had been, but it carried the weight of 72 years. With that final flourish of the pen, something inside me settled. The house was no longer a burden. It was no longer a battlefield. It was my gift to Thomas, secured against the erasure Emily had tried to force upon me. That night, back in my quiet kitchen, I made myself tea and sat by the window as the streetlights flickered on. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt peace. Not the brittle kind you pretend to feel for the sake of harmony, but the deep, steady kind that grows from knowing you've done what's right. I no longer feared being invisible. I no longer worried about being written out of photographs or memories. Because now, even if Emily tried to erase me, the truth was inked into legal papers. My sacrifice was preserved. Thomas would know, and that was enough. Over the next days, I made small changes in my own life. I dusted off old hobbies I had neglected, painting, knitting, tending my garden with more patience than I'd had in years. I called a few friends I had drifted from, inviting them for coffee. I laughed more. I breathed easier. It struck me how much space Emily had taken up in my heart with her dismissals, her cold remarks, her endless need for control. And now that I had reclaimed that space, I could finally fill it with something better. Myself. One afternoon, Thomas came over after school. We baked cookies together, his small hands clumsy with the dough, flour dusting his cheeks like snow. He looked up at me suddenly and asked, "Grandma, why don't you come live with us?" I paused, brushing the flour off his nose with a gentle finger. Because, sweetheart, sometimes people forget how to share space with love, and until they remember, it's better for Grandma to have her own place. He tilted his head, not fully understanding, but then he smiled and said, "I like it here better anyway. It smells like cookies." I laughed, hugging him tightly. In that moment, I realized something important. I didn't need Emily's approval, her recognition, or her photographs. I had what mattered. Thomas's love, and that love would outlast any party, any caption, any attempt to erase me. A few days later, Emily called. Her tone was clipped, almost brittle. "Mom, about the other night. I just don't understand why you had to do that." I listened quietly, letting her spill her frustration. When she finally paused, I answered simply, "Because, Emily, I'm not a guest in your life, and I never will be again." There was silence on the other end, then a curt goodbye. I didn't feel anger when I hung up. I felt release. For once, her disapproval didn't matter. My worth wasn't tied to her acceptance anymore. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold. My hands rested calmly in my lap, my breath steady. For so long, I had feared being forgotten. But now I realize the truth. Dignity isn't given by others. It's claimed by yourself. I may be 72. My hair may be gray. My back not as strong as it once was. But I am not invisible. I am Margaret Ann Hayes, a mother, a grandmother, a woman who built, who gave, who endured, and who finally learned when to stand tall. And I would never again sit quietly in the corner. Months passed. Winter melted into spring, and with it the bitterness that had once weighed on me seemed to thaw as well. My days were quieter, simpler, but filled with a peace I hadn't known in years. Then, one evening, the phone rang. It was Emily. Her voice was tight, almost trembling. "Mom, we're having trouble. David's hours got cut, the bills are piling up, and—" She hesitated, then forced the words out. "We need help. Could we stay with you for a while?" I sat very still, my teacup warm in my hands. For a moment I thought of all the nights I had sacrificed for her, all the corners I had been shoved into, all the photographs where I had been erased. And then I thought of Thomas, his laughter, his love, his innocence. I took a slow breath. "Emily," I said gently, "I'll always be your mother. But I will never again be your corner." There was silence on the line, heavy and stunned. She tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. I ended the call softly, setting the phone down. Outside, the evening sky stretched wide and calm, painted in the colors of a life reclaimed. I smiled to myself. I was no longer invisible, and this time, the story ended on my terms.